Okay, we have our last video today over chapters 8 and 9. It's a short one. We're just going to page through. The two chapters. There's a couple of scenes that I want to point out to you and just reread a little bit and talk about in more depth. But otherwise, we're sort of at the end of the book. We've seen the chapter 7. We're on chapter 8. So have your book out, please. This would be a good day to have the lights on. So I'm not going to show you any pictures or do anything like that. But I do expect that you will kind of follow along in the book with me so you can see what we have going on. We're going to start really on page 148 in the book. Page 148. Right here, it was the night that he told me the strange story of his youth. Says, it was the night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Dan Cody. Told it to me because Jay Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice. That's a key sentence. Why does Gatsby tell Nick the truth about his past? Nick doesn't find out until right now, not until after the entire hotel scene. Yes, we've known for a couple of chapters, but in linear, with Nick living it chronologically, Nick doesn't know until right now. So take a moment and ask your desk mate, why do you think Gatsby tells Nick now? And he tells it to you in the text. You can go back and reread it. I think we want to remember that Gatsby has motives, right? Remember I drew that plot line on the board, and I put that line that says motivation. Like, what is his motivation what is his motivation for doing the actions? Why would he tell Nick right now who he really is? Gatsby's a lot more manipulative than we give him credit for. Here he just left the hotel scene where Tom calls him out, and he has to save face. He has to tell Nick something. So to read again, it says, told it to me because Jay Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice, and the long, secret extravaganza was played out. I think that he would have acknowledged anything now, without reserve, but he wanted to talk about Daisy. When we read this next part, I want you to be thinking about what is it that Gatsby really loves about Daisy. Look at what he's describing about her. She was the first nice girl he had ever known. In various unrevealed capacities he had come in contact with such people, but always with indiscernible barbed wire between. He had found her excitingly desirable. He went to her house, at first with other officers from Camp Taylor, then alone. It amazed him. He had never been in such a beautiful house before. But what gave it an air of breathless intensity was that Daisy lived there. It was as casual a thing to her as his tent out at camp was to him. There was a ripe mystery about it. A hint of bedrooms upstairs more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms, of gay and radiant activities taking place through its corridors, and of romances that were not musty and laid away already in lavender, but fresh and breathing and redolent of this year's shiny motor cars, and of dances whose flowers were scarcely withered. What he finds when he goes into Daisy's house is that this money, he can see sort of what money can do. Right? And what money can do is it allows things to be fresh, that things are always new. And I think this sentence is sort of telling of Gatsby. It excited him too that many men had already loved Daisy. It increased her value in his eyes. That is such an interesting thing to say about someone, isn't it? It's like, you would think, but he loves things that, he really loves things that other people love. He wants to own the things that people want, and Daisy's sort of a hot commodity. But he knew he was in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. However glorious might be his future as Jay Gatsby, he was at present a penniless young man without a past, and at any moment the invisible cloak of his uniform might slip from his shoulders. So he made the most of his time. He took what he could get, ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually he took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. I want you to re-look at that. What does that mean that he took her one night? Take a guess with your desk mate. If you are guessing, the obvious answer that he probably took her virginity, that he slept with her, then, you'd be correct. That's what he did. And look at the reason he does it, though. He took what he could get, ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually he took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. It isn't that he loves her. It's almost like he's doing it to prove that he can do it. Like he's not supposed to. He doesn't come from anything. He doesn't come from any money. She's supposed to, not be anywhere around him. And he has this opportunity where he's in this uniform in front of her. And, what does a uniform do? It hides the clothes you normally wear. And clothes you wear tell you sort of where you fall in life, especially in the 20s, how expensive your clothes are. And he takes everything that he can get from her. He knows he's charming. That's not a question. And it goes on and says, he might have despised himself, for he had certainly taken her under false pretenses. I don't mean that he had traded on his phantom millions, but he had deliberately given Daisy a sense of security. He let her believe that he was a person from much the same stratum as herself, that he was fully able to take care of her. As a matter of fact, he had no such faculties. He had no comfortable family standing behind him, and he was liable at the whim of an impersonal government to be blown anywhere around the world. But he didn't despise himself. And it didn't turn out as he had imagined. He had intended, probably, to take what he could and go, but now he found that he had committed himself to following a grail. He knew that Daisy was extraordinary, but he didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. She vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. He felt married to her, that was all. When I read those lines and I read that paragraph, I often think like he went into this relationship with Daisy as sort of like I'm only thinking of puns that will come off awful, so I'm not going to say them, but to sort of like, get away with something that he shouldn't be getting away with. That he can like take this girl and he can get what he wants from her, and he's sort of like breaking the rules a little bit. He's not really supposed to be able to do these things. And what he finds is that, even though he's trying to use her and he's trying to like build himself up by taking her down, he finds that that's not what happened. Like he sleeps with her and he doesn't feel like a sense of vindication because she just goes back to her life. She's unaffected by it. And he feels sort of like he was used in a way, like he's missing something. And so he begins like this pining after Daisy, that not necessarily Daisy, but what her wealth and her lifestyle allows her to do. Allows her just to, disappear into her house, into her life, into her never-ending parties, and she doesn't have to think about Gatsby. And he gets kind of like, well, that's the plan kind of backfired, right? Like he was supposed to walk in there and, take what he could get out of there and like, be able to leave with the story. I don't know. But that's not necessarily what happens. It says, when they meet again 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him, and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. And what he realized is that her money allows her to be above everything else. She doesn't have the worries that he has. She doesn't think, about life the way he does. It seems easier to some extent. It seems new all the time. There's that line in there that says, aware wealth, though youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, that she can stay forever young, kind of, that the money buys that and sort of preserves that. And he goes on and says, I can't describe to you how surprised I was to find out I loved her, old sport. I even hoped for a while that she'd throw me over, but she didn't, because she was in love with me too. She thought I knew a lot because I knew different things from her. Well, there I was, way off my ambitions, getting deeper in love every minute, and all of a sudden I didn't care. What was the use of doing great things if I didn't have a better time telling her what I was going to do? On the last afternoon before he went abroad, he sat with Daisy in his arms for a long, silent time. It was a cold fall day with fire in the room, and her cheeks flushed. Now and then she moved, and he changed his arm a little, and once he kissed her dark, shining hair. The afternoon had made them tranquil for a while, as if to give them a deep memory for the long parting the next day promised. They had never been closer in their month of love, not communicated more profoundly one with another than when she brushed her silent lips against his coat's shoulder, or when he touched the end of her fingers gently, as though she were asleep. And he says that he's in love with Daisy, but I think he sort of tricked himself into thinking that. I don't know if it's necessarily Daisy that he's in love with, as much as it is what she represents, and how easy her life can be because of the money she has. She's like the epitome of what he wants. He did extraordinarily well in the war. He was captain before he went to the front, and following the Argonne battles, he got his majority and the command of his divisional machine guns. After the armistice, he tried frantically to get home, but some complication or misunderstanding sent him to Oxford instead. He was worried now. There was a quality of nervous despair in Daisy's letters. She didn't see why he couldn't come. She was feeling the pressure of the world outside, and she wanted to see him and feel his presence beside her and be reassured that she was doing the right thing after all. For Daisy was young, and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery and orchestras which set the rhythm of the year, summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. All night the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues, which 100 pairs of golden and silver slippers shuffled the shining dust. At the gray tea hour there were always rooms that throbbed incessantly with this low, sweet fever, while fresh faces drifted here and there like rose petals blown by the sad horns through the floor. This is like a lot of words to basically say that part of her life is she goes to these parties and she sees these people and they're, hooking up and they're moving on with their lives and they're getting married, and it's sort of making her feel restless. She just keeps going to these parties and she's ready for her life to move on. Through this twilight universe, Daisy began to move again with the season. Suddenly she was again keeping 6 dates a day with 6 men, and drowsing asleep at dawn with the beads in the chiffon of an evening dress tangled among dying orchids on the floor beside her bed. And all the time something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately. And the decision must be made by some force of love, of money, of unquestionable practicality, that was close at hand. So she's feeling that pressure that she needs to move forward in her life. And she doesn't know what's going to do it. Will it be love? Will it be for the money? Or will it be practical? The force took shape in the middle of spring with the arrival of Tom Buchanan. There was a wholesome bulkiness about his person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. Doubtless there was a certain struggle and a certain relief. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still in Oxford. And I think that second to last line is so important. Doubtless there was a certain struggle. Okay, so she had a hard time doing it, letting him go. But it's the next part of the sentence. And a certain relief. Because what she wants is she wants to be married. She wants to start that part of her life. She gets it with Tom Buchanan. So you have to ask yourself, how in love with Gatsby was Daisy to begin with? She had a lot going on in her life. I'm going to move forward a bit. On page 154, there's probably the most famous line of the book. The thing that gets quoted the most. Try to move it forward here. Gatsby says he's going to use his pool, foreshadowing, and he wants to know if Nick will use it with him. And Nick says no, he has to go to work. And then Nick turns around and he shouts this thing right here. He shouts, "They're a rotten crowd," I shouted across the lawn. "You're worth the whole damn bunch put together." He says, "I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end." First he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on the fact all the time. His gorgeous pink rag of a suit made a bright spot of color against the white steps, and I thought of the night when I first came to his ancestral home 3 months before. The lawn and the drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption, and he had stood on those steps, concealing his incorruptible dream, as he waved them goodbye. I question Nick on that a little bit. Was Gatsby's dream really that uncorrupted? I mean, how pure was his dream? Nick sees it that he wanted Daisy for love, but when you look at all of the details, I'm not necessarily sure that he really loved Daisy. He loved what she represented, no question. But I don't know if that means that he loved her, and I don't know if it necessarily means his dream was uncorrupted. He had to cheat his way to get his dream to begin with. He had to steal the money. So I don't know if you can say that that's necessarily uncorrupted. Then it kind of takes a turn, and we talk George Wilson. We get George Wilson back in play, and through some questioning, he kind of figures out who Myrtle's killer is. He thinks it's Tom because of the color of the car, and he's going to go back. He's going to approach Tom. If you look at the bottom of page 158, he's like, he murdered her. He figured out that she was killed, and he figures out that he has that Myrtle had a wealthy mister. She was a mistress to someone because of the dog collar. She has an expensive dog leash, and of course she doesn't have a dog. She has one at the apartment with Tom, but she doesn't have one with George at all, so it kind of raises a red flag. And then we have Gatsby's death, and it's such a subtle, throwaway scene. We're going to read it for a moment. It's super short, and I want you to think about while we read it on page 161. Why would Fitzgerald make his death this way, make Gatsby's death this way? I'm going to move forward here so I have it up in front this way. Okay, I'm going to start where it says no telephone message arrived, and that's on page 161 right in the middle. It says, no telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock. Okay, so he's waiting, presumably for a telephone call from Daisy. At least that's what Nick thinks. By the end of chapter 9, we know he's really waiting for a telephone call from his boss to see if the deal went through. But Nick thinks it's from Daisy, and maybe to some degree, it is. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went out without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. I have an idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old, warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at the unfamiliar sky through frightened leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. What Nick is saying here is he's saying if Gatsby didn't believe that the phone call would come, then he would have given up on his dream. And if that were true, if he would have given up on his dream, it would mean that the world as he had known it would no longer exist, and everything would be new. Like he would look at a rose, he wouldn't know what it is, and he would think it was ugly because he doesn't know it's supposed to be beautiful, right? How raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. And it would seem like a new world, like this was a new world opening up to Gatsby, one without his dream. A new world, material without being real. And here's where it's very subtle, but here is where we start to get the tiny amount of information that Gatsby's about to die. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like that ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. And that's the key, the ashen, fantastic figure, because it replicates the Valley of Ashes in the way they were described in chapter 2. So if we had our detail glasses on, we would know that that's Wilson right there. The chauffeur, he was one of Wolfsheim's protégés, heard the shots. Afterward, he could only say that he hadn't thought anything much about them. I drove from the station directly to Gatsby's house, and my rushing anxiously up the front steps was the first thing that alarmed anyone. But they knew then, I firmly believe. With scarcely a word, 4 of us, the chauffeur, butler, gardener, and I, hurried down to the pool. There was a faint, barely perceptible movement of the water as the fresh flow from one end urged its way toward the drain at the other. And then it's just this image, and it's a really subtle image, right, of the water moving on the pool, like maybe the wind blowing, with the little ripples that were hardly the shadows of waves. The laden mattress, so the laden means like heavy, so there's a mattress in the pool, and there's something heavy on top of it, right, like holding it down. The laden mattress moved irregularly down the pool. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course with its accidental burden. And we know that accidental burden, that's Gatsby's dead body. And corrugated is kind of something you might say with blood as well. So it's kind of a play on words there. The touch of a cluster of leaves revolved it slowly, tracing, like the leg of transit, a thin red circle in the water. And then that's the mention of blood being there. I was like, wow, that is, if you might have read that and not even realized that Gatsby died. That's how subtle that is. Like, sometimes we have to read that. People have to read that paragraph twice, 3 times and did Gatsby die there? Yeah, he died there. So if you didn't know, Gatsby died there. And at the end it says, it was after we started with Gatsby toward the house that the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete. So then Wilson killed himself after he killed Gatsby. And it's interesting because this book was written before World War II. It was written in the 1920s, so Holocaust didn't have the meaning that it does now. But what Holocaust means essentially is death by fire. Okay, so think about that, where Wilson comes from. He comes from the Valley of Ashes. And that's such a precise word, and you can think about it in one way of Wilson, who represents like the ash, which comes from fire, right? And then he represents like the passion of his dream, that his dream just like kills him in the end. So again, a throwaway sentence, but there really are no throwaway sentences in this book. Okay, chapter 9. A couple of things I want to talk about in chapter 9. I just want to talk about his work for a moment. Well, Daisy leaves because Daisy and Tom can leave, and wow, they can just like disappear in their wealth and move on to someplace else. Nobody will come to Gatsby's funeral. On page 166, that's the page I want you to turn to. 166. I have to go to the table of contents. Give me a moment. Chapter 9. Okay, page 166. And it's Slagle. It's like when the phone rang. Right here, when the phone rang that afternoon and long distance said Chicago was calling, I thought this would be Daisy at last. But the connection came through as a man's voice, very thin and far away. Is this Slagle speaking? Yes. The name was unfamiliar. Hell of a note, isn't it? Get my wire? There haven't been any wires. Young Park's in trouble, he said rapidly. They picked him up when he handed the bonds over the counter. They got a circular from New York giving him the numbers just 5 minutes before. What do you know about that, hey? You never can tell about these hick towns. Hello? I interrupted breathlessly. Look here, this isn't Mr. Gatsby. Mr. Gatsby's dead. There was a long silence on the other end of the wire, followed by an exclamation, then a quick squawk when the connection was broken. And this is the part I really want you to pay attention to. You might not know necessarily what a bond is, but a bond is like a piece of paper. You can go to a bank and then you can like cash it for money. It's kind of like, usually bonds were more money than like checks, and so you'd have, you've heard of stocks and bonds, things like that. Well, in the 20s, you don't have the the technology that you do now, so things aren't electronic, which means you could forge things, and it would take a bank 2-3 days, maybe even a week, before they would know that the thing you forged was fake. So do you remember back in chapter 5 when Gatsby gets that phone call when they're in their bedroom, and he says, if you think, Detroit's your idea of a small town, then you don't know what a small town is, or whatever he says. They're setting up this sort of, heist probably isn't the right word, but they're setting up this sort of robbery where they're trying to go to a small town, a place where tellers maybe wouldn't see bonds very often, so they wouldn't be able to pick out a fraudulent bond very well, and then they're going to give fake bonds, get the cash for them, and disappear, and the bank won't know that they're fake for another 3 to 5 days. So they try it. They go to Chicago. They tried in Chicago. He handed the bonds over, and right before they got there, they got a circular from New York giving them the numbers just 5 minutes before. So clearly the cops had been sort of on the trail, like knew these things were happening, because this cannot have been the first time it happened, right? If the cops know that this fraud, these bonds are being, what's the word I'm thinking of? These bonds are being, made, whatever. They had to have been doing it. This couldn't have been the first time. But the real question is, who do we know in this book who also deals with bonds? Whose job is it? It's Nick's job. And do you remember back in chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5, when Gatsby offers Nick a job? He says, I have a little bit of a side business here. And Nick says, well, because it was for a service to be rendered. He thinks it's because he's hooking him up with Daisy. He turns it down. Is that really why Gatsby is offering this job to Nick? I don't think so. I think it's because Nick knows something about bonds. If anybody's going to fake a bond, forge a bond, a guy who deals with bonds would. So that was Gatsby trying to get Nick into this business with him. So again, how much stuff do we really want to believe about Gatsby? And what Nick is telling us. So nobody will go, right, and see him. And then I just want you to turn to page 171. I want to read this little section here where we finally get to talk to Meyer Wolfsheim, because I think it's important. I kind of skipped Gats, his dad, but I'll come back to it. So he goes in there, right? It's bottom of page 170. My memory goes back to the first time I met him, right here, this part. My memory goes back to the first time I met him, bottom page 170. He says, my memory goes back to when I first met him, he said. A young major just out of the army and covered over with medals he got in the war. He was so hard up he had to keep on wearing his uniform because he couldn't buy some regular clothes. First time I saw him was when he was in Weinbrenner's pool room at 43rd Street and asked for a job. He hadn't eaten anything for a couple of days. Come on, have some lunch with me, I said. He ate more than $4 worth of food in half an hour. Did you start him in the business? I inquired. Start him? I made him. Oh. I raised him out of nothing, right out of the gutter. I saw right away he was a fine appearing, gentlemanly young man. When he told me he was from Oxford, I knew I could use him. I got him to join up on the American Legion, and he used to stand high there. Right off he did some work for a client of mine up in Albany. We were so thick like that and everything. He held up two bulbous fingers, always together. I wondered if that partnership had included the World Series transaction in 1919. And then it goes on from there. And I guess the question I have, and what some scholars have, brought up was, is Dan Cody real? Why would Gatsby tell us the truth about who Dan Cody was? Some people like to say that Dan Cody is a combination of two fictional characters, Daniel Boone and Wild Bill Cody, which were popular in the 20s. And they speculate as to whether Dan Cody was actually somebody Gatsby knew in real life or not. Since the name is kind of fictional, I wonder if it makes more sense that this guy that he hooked Gatsby up with up in Albany is maybe the guy in the picture. I don't know. I don't know what I believe on it. There isn't a definitive answer in the book. But I know Gatsby lies to us a lot. And I know that he only tells Nick the truth after Tom calls him out and he has no other choice. He has to save face. Otherwise, he loses Nick. And I know that, Gatsby likes to fake relationships. The way he says old sport, how he found Nick at the party, how he uses an army connection to sort of, create a level of intimacy that wouldn't already be there, how he uses Wolfsheim to make him sound good. And so I just wonder, is Dan Cody real? Take a moment and tell your desk mate, what do you think? Do you think Dan Cody is real? And I'll get my next little thing set up. Almost done. So I just want to show you two more things. On page 172, it's with his father. And it's back a little bit. His dad comes and to the funeral. He sees that it's there. It's kind of in the middle. And it was... shoot, I had a hard time. Let's go this way. It's like this is missing a page. Oh, there it was. Okay. This is where I want to start. Sorry. It's a photograph. It was a photo. This is Gatsby's dad showing this photograph of the house. Now, does this remind you of anything? Here is Gatsby's dad, like literally standing in the house that this photograph is of. But he can't even think about the house. The only thing he can do is point to this photograph. And it reminds me so much of Gatsby when he was with Daisy and he refused to acknowledge that, his dream was standing right next to him, and instead he was focused more on his dream. And we see that right here. It says, it was a photograph of the house cracked in the corners and dirty with many hands. He pointed out every detail to me eagerly. "Look here," and then sought admiration from my eyes. He had shown it so often that I think it was more real to him than the house itself. And I think that that line is applied to Gatsby as well. That Gatsby had thought about the dream so often that it was more real to him than Daisy was actually real. And that's part of the problem. For everything that Gatsby says about his parents, how he didn't want to be the son of his parents, he's definitely his father's child. It's kind of, can't get away from that. All right, last thing is we have to read the ending. One of the most famous endings of any book. We're going to start on page 179. And it really sort of talks about what was happening there. Right there, Gatsby's house was still and empty when I left. And what Nick is going to do is he's going to start imagining like what this looked like before there were houses, because he uses this language throughout the novel of being like a settler or a colonizer, or like, when he's going out on an adventure to like on new lands, new territories. And so we're seeing that here in this last part. All right. It says, Gatsby's house was still empty when I left. The grass on his lawn had grown as long as mine. One of the taxi drivers in the village never took a fare past the entrance gate without stopping for a minute and pointing inside. Perhaps it was he who drove Daisy and Gatsby over to East Egg the night of the accident, and perhaps he had made a story about it all his own. I didn't want to hear it, and I avoided him when I got off the train. I spent my Saturday nights in New York because those gleaming, dazzling parties of his were with me so vividly that I could still hear the music and the laughter, faint and incessant, from his gardens, and the cars going up and down his drive. One night I did hear a material car there and saw its light stop at his front steps, but I didn't investigate. Probably it was some final guest who had been away at the ends of the earth and didn't know that the party was over. On the last night, with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at a huge, incoherent failure of a house once more. Remember, houses in here are symbolic for the people, right? If a house is a failure, then Gatsby's the failure. On the white steps, an obscene word scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick stood out clearly in the moonlight, and I erased it, drawing my shoe raspily along the stone. Then I wandered down to the beach and sprawled out on the sand. Now here he's going to start imagining what it looked like before all of this. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy moving glow of the ferry boats across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh, green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. Compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commiserate to his capacity for wonder. And as I sat there brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then. But that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And wow, what an ending to a book. I want to pick out a couple of things that I think you might be overlooking. That idea that his dream was already behind him. He says, And his dream must have seemed to move so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He didn't know now that it was already behind him, somewhere back in the vast obscurity beyond the city. That part of Gatsby's mistake is that he based a future endeavor on a past dream. And there's a danger in that, because you can't ever base your future on something happened in the past. And read this line again. How is it? It ends in a big dash. We've been talking about sentences and putting sentences together and the way you do it. And it's supposed to end some way. It's not supposed to end the way it does. If it says, Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. That's a great word played there, right? Like as we get farther and farther into the future, that green light, that dream, gets farther and farther away from us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning, how's that supposed to end? If we're running faster, we're stretching out our arms further, one day we're supposed to be able to get that dream. That's how it's supposed to end. But it doesn't. A long dash interrupts that thought, and it ends on this line. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Oh, the repetition of that B is just perfect. But have you ever, in the summertime, my family likes to kayak on the Missouri River. And one year I said to my dad, I was like, and by kayaking, I mean we sit in the kayak and we let the current take us down the river. And we don't really even paddle, we just hang out. And I said, Dad, let's turn the kayak around and let's go against the current. And I'm trying my hardest to paddle against the current. You can't do it. It's impossible. It was so hard. My dad got a little further. I just stayed in one spot. My mom, who's this tiny human being, she just got pushed back. She just got pushed. She couldn't go anywhere with it. It's so difficult to paddle against stream. And so here he is. That final line. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. We think we're moving forward, and there's just no way that we can do it. It's a beautiful, tragic, kind of depressing ending. I'll read it one last time. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And when I read this book every year, I read it as Fitzgerald giving us a warning, right? We're all going to have dreams. And as time goes on, we're going to have dreams that we aren't able to fulfill. And he is warning us. Because we're going to want to. We're going to want to be Gatsby at the edge of a dock with our arms stretched out, reaching for that green light. And Fitzgerald is telling us, don't do it. It will kill you. You cannot get it. And he ends his book on that. So not really, an upper, but interesting nonetheless. Okay, I hope you enjoy the movie.